Camelia Denise, a woman who has spent her life trying to outrun her father's failures, is forcibly handed over to Ricardo Alfonso, the Ice King of the city, to settle a debt she didn't create. What starts as a terrifying hostage situation in a high-rise penthouse turns into a lethal game of attraction when Ricardo presents her with a diamond choker that feels more like a collar than jewelry. As Ricardo eliminates a traitor in front of her without breaking eye contact, he declares her his most precious asset. And Camelia realizes she hasn't just been sold, she has been recruited into a war, where the only way to stay alive is to make the city's most feared man fall in love with her.
The heavy oak doors of the Alfonso estate closed with a finality that sounded like a gavel striking a death sentence. Camelia stood in the center of a foyer so fast, it felt like a cathedral built to worship ancient, violent gods. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen tears, casting sharp, fractured light over the marble floors. "This is your world now, Camelia." Ricardo's voice drifted from behind her, smooth and cold as the blade of a knife. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight, a heat that radiated against her back. He stepped into her line of sight, his tailored black suit blending into the shadows of the hallway. The vertical scar on his brow seemed deeper in the dim light, a jagged reminder that everything in this house was won through blood. "You'll find your belongings in the East Wing," he continued, his light eyes tracking the pulse jumping in her throat. "Everything you owned before. My women do not wear rags." Camelia felt a surge of cold fury beneath her fear. "I'm not one of your women, Ricardo. I'm a debt payment. Let's not pretend there's any dignity in that." Ricardo took a slow, predatory step forward. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light, a symbol of a man who owned time itself. He reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the diamond choker he had clasped around her neck earlier. The stones were cold, but his skin was impossibly warm, a startling contrast that made her breath hitch. "In this city, dignity is a luxury for the dead," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "Here, you are protected, you are envied, you are the only beautiful thing in a house full of ghosts. Sleep well, Camelia. The cage may be gold, but I assure you, I am the only one with the key." He turned on his heel and disappeared into the gloom of his study, leaving her alone in the silence. A maid, eyes cast strictly to the floor, led Camelia to her quarters. The room was a masterpiece of silk and velvet, overlooking the rain-slicked skyline of the city she no longer belonged to. On the vanity sat a single black rose in a crystal vase, and an array of jewelry that cost more than her father's life was worth. Camelia walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, her reflection staring back at her, a stunning woman in a formal gown, marked by a single glistening tear. She touched the diamond collar, the glamorous leash that defined her new life. She was no longer Camelia Denise, the waitress, the daughter, the survivor. She was the trophy of the Ice King. As the storm lashed against the glass, she realized the true danger wasn't the men with guns outside the gates. It was the terrifying warmth of the man who had locked her inside.
The silence of the Alfonso estate was never truly peaceful. It was a heavy, pressurized thing, like the air before a lightning strike. Camelia wandered the corridors of the second floor, her bare feet sinking into plush Persian rugs that muffled her escape. She found herself drawn toward a sliver of amber light spilling from a partially open door at the end of the gallery, the private library. She expected to see the Don at his mahogany desk, cold and calculating as he moved pieces across the city's metaphorical chessboard. Instead, the sight that met her made her heart stutter. Ricardo was slumped in a velvet armchair, his black suit jacket discarded on the floor. His crisp white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and ancient ink. He wasn't reading. His head was tilted back, eyes closed, and his breath came in ragged, shallow hitches. In the flickering firelight, the lethal elegance was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged exhaustion that made him look human and dangerously fragile. On the side table sat a glass of amber liquid and a small weathered photograph. As Camelia stepped closer, a floorboard ground. Ricardo's eyes snapped open. In a flash, his hand moved toward the holster at his side, his predatory instincts screaming before his mind could catch up. He stopped the moment his gaze landed on her. The lethal sharpness in his light-colored eyes flickered, then softened into something Camelia hadn't seen before. Shame. "I didn't give you permission to be here," he rasped, though the bite was missing from his tone. "You look like you're in pain," Camelia whispered, ignoring his warning. She moved toward him, her gaze falling on the photograph. It was a faded image of a woman who shared his sharp jawline, but possessed a kindness he had clearly buried. Ricardo looked at the photo, his jaw tightening so hard the scar on his cheek flared white. "Pain is a teacher, Camelia. It's the only thing that doesn't lie in this business." He reached for his glass, but his hand trembled. Just a fraction, a micro-tremor of nerves or perhaps a memory he couldn't kill. Before she could talk herself out of it, Camelia reached out. Her fingers, dark and radiant against his pale shirt, settled gently over his shaking hand. His skin was scorching, that warm skin that defied his cold blood reputation. Ricardo froze. He looked at her hand as if it were a strange, beautiful bird that had landed on a battlefield. He didn't pull away. Instead, he let a long, shuddering breath. His head dropped forward until his forehead rested against her abdomen. It wasn't a sexual gesture. It was the heavy, desperate lean of a man who had been carrying the weight of a mountain and finally found a place to rest. "Don't look at me like this," he murmured into the silk of her robe. "If the city sees me bleed, we both die." "The city isn't here, Ricardo," she said softly. Her hand moved to the back of his neck, finding the soft hair at the nape. In that moment, the beast was gone, and for the first time, Camelia realized the golden cage didn't just keep her in, it kept the world out. The grand ballroom of the Solaris Heights was a sea of shimmering silk and whispered conspiracies, illuminated by chandeliers that hung like frozen explosions of light. Camelia stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand trembling slightly against the cool banister. She wore a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her curves like a second skin, but it was the weight around her throat that felt heaviest, the wide diamond choker, reflecting the predatory glint in the eyes of the men below. Beside her, Ricardo was a shadow carved from stone. He looked every bit the Ice King, his tailored tuxedo sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't look at her, yet his hand moved to the small of her back, his palm a brand of heat through the fabric. "Breathe, Camelia," he murmured, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. "They are wolves, but you are mine. That makes you the most dangerous thing in this room." As they descended, the music seemed to falter, a ripple of silence spreading through the crowd. This was her debut, the moment the underground elite realized that Don hadn't just settled a debt, he had claimed a queen. Camelia felt the weight of 1,000 judgments. She saw the sneers of the debutantes and the calculating stares of the rival bosses, but she kept her chin high, her radiant skin glowing under the spotlight. A rival lieutenant, a man named Ivanov, with eyes like oily glass, stepped into their path, a champagne flute held loosely in his hand. "So, the rumors are true, Alfonso. You've found a jewel to decorate your cage. Tell me, does she speak or is she just for show?" The air around Ricardo plummeted into sub-zero temperatures. His hand tightened on Camelia's waist, not in a squeeze of comfort, but in a claim of absolute sovereignty. "She is the only person in this room whose voice I care to hear," Ricardo replied, his tone conversational, yet laced with a promise of violence. "And I would advise you not to let your eyes linger on what doesn't belong to you, Ivanov. I have killed men for less than a stare." Camelia felt the tension snap like a taut wire. She didn't shrink away. Instead, she stepped half an inch forward. Her gaze locked onto Ivanov's with a resilience that surprised even herself. "He doesn't just own the jewel," she said, her voice steady and clear. "He owns the vault it's kept in. I'd be careful where you try to break in." Ricardo's gaze flickered toward her, a spark of dark pride igniting in his light-colored eyes. For a moment, the cold blood persona cracked, and the man who had rested his head against her in the library resurfaced. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, as the music swelled back to life.
"Careful, Camellia," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "If you keep acting like a queen, I might never let you go."
The aftermath of the gala felt like a fever dream that refused to break. While the city slept, the Alfonso estate remained a labyrinth of secrets, its silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a slowing heartbeat. Camellia found herself unable to sleep, the weight of the diamond choker still phantom tight around her neck even after she had removed it. Seeking a glass of water, she wandered into the west wing, but a door left slightly ajar, leading to a room she had been strictly forbidden to enter, drew her in. It wasn't a torture chamber or a vault of stashed currency. It was a sterile, cold office that smelled of old paper and antiseptic. On the desk lay a thick, weathered file, its edges frayed. Driven by a desperate need to understand the man who held her life in his hands, Camellia opened it. Inside were grainy black and white photographs of a much younger Ricardo, his face clean of scars but his eyes wide with a terror she didn't recognize. She began to read the handwritten police reports from 2 decades ago. They detailed a brutal betrayal, not by a rival, but by his own family. To consolidate power, Ricardo's father had used his own son as bait, leaving him in the hands of a sadistic cartel for weeks. The vertical scar that now defined his face hadn't been a trophy of war. It was a mark of correction from the man who was supposed to protect him. The report noted that Ricardo had been forced to execute the very men he grew up with to prove he was hard enough to survive the night his father abandoned him. You were never supposed to see that. Camellia spun around, the file slipping from her fingers. Ricardo stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the harsh hallway light. He didn't look angry, he looked hollow. The Ice King was gone, leaving behind only the ghost of the boy in the photographs. "Is this why you're so cold?" Camellia whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the secret. "Because the only person you ever trusted taught you that love is just a way to sharpen a blade?" Ricardo walked toward her, his footsteps heavy. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow looming over the evidence of his trauma. "My father didn't just give me a scar, Camellia. He gave me a philosophy. If you love nothing, nothing can be used to break you." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he pulled back, as if afraid his very touch might contaminate her. For the first time, Camellia didn't see a captor. She saw a man who had built a fortress around his heart and called it an empire. The first crack in his armor wasn't just visible, it was a gaping wound.
The rainy season in the city didn't just bring water, it brought a blurring of boundaries. Camellia sat in the back of the armored sedan, the scent of Ricardo's expensive cologne, something like cedar and ozone, filling the cramped space. They were returning from a late-night meeting at the docks, the atmosphere between them still fragile from the secrets unearthed in his office. "You're staring again," Ricardo said, his gaze fixed on the passing neon lights. "I'm trying to find the boy in the photograph," Camellia replied softly. Before he could sharpen his tongue for a retort, the world turned upside down. A deafening roar shattered the night as a black SUV rammed their side, the impact sending the sedan spinning across the slick asphalt. Glass exploded like diamonds in the dark. "Get down," Ricardo roared. His hand, heavy and certain, slammed onto the back of her neck, shoving her toward the floorboards just as a hail of gunfire peppered the door. The car screeched to a halt against a concrete barrier. Silence followed, ringing and lethal. Ricardo didn't hesitate. He kicked his door open, his handgun drawn in a single fluid motion. But he didn't run for cover. He reached back, grabbing Camellia's waist and hauling her into the shadow of the wreckage. They were pressed chest to chest behind the twisted metal of the engine block. Rain lashed down, drenching Camellia's thin silk dress until it was a second skin. Ricardo's body was a shield of pure muscle and heat, his warm skin burning against her cold, trembling frame. He looked down at her, his light eyes scanning her face for injuries with a frantic intensity that bypassed his usual calculation. "Are you hit?" he barked over the sound of approaching footsteps. "No," she gasped, her hands clutching his lapels. "Ricardo, behind you!" He spun, firing 2 silent shots that dropped a shadowy figure emerging from the mist. In the aftermath of the muzzle flashes, he turned back to her. His adrenaline was a tangible force, making the air between them vibrate. For a heartbeat, the Ice King vanished. He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb trembling against the single tear tracing its way through the rain on her cheek. "I told you,"
he whispered, his voice jagged and raw. "If you're seen as my weakness, they will come for you. And God help me, Camellia, I can't let them take you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the freezing air. It was a line in the sand, a silent admission that she was no longer just a trophy to be displayed, but a heart he was terrified to lose. As sirens wailed in the distance, Camellia realized the most dangerous place in the world wasn't in the line of fire. It was right here, wrapped in the arms of the man who had finally admitted he was broken.
The aftermath of the assassination attempt left the Alfonso estate in a state of suffocating lockdown. Ricardo had become a ghost, a silhouette pacing behind reinforced glass, leaving Camellia to wander the gardens under the watchful eyes of silent guards. It was there, near the iron gates where the scent of rain-drenched jasmine hung heavy, that she found the note. It had been slipped into the pocket of her discarded shawl, a slip of paper smelling of expensive tobacco and old ink. "Tonight, the North Pier, I can give you the life Ricardo stole." The sender was Ivanov, the oily-eyed rival from the gala. He promised her a flight out of the country, a new identity, and the eraser of her father's debt. It was the sovereignty she had craved since the night she was sold. Yet, as she stood by the pier hours later, the salt air stinging her skin, the freedom felt hollow. She looked at the dark water and saw not a path home, but the reflection of the man she had left behind, the monster who had leaned his forehead against hers in the rain. "You came." Ivanov's voice emerged from the shadows of a shipping container. He stepped into the moonlight, flanked by 4 men whose hands rested visibly on their holsters. "I thought a woman of your intelligence would realize that being a trophy is a short-lived career. Ricardo will eventually tire of you, or he'll get you killed. Come with me, and you're free." Camellia looked at the boat bobbing in the harbor, then back at Ivanov. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady. "Why risk a war with the Ice King for a debt collector's daughter?" Ivanov's smile was a jagged thing. "Because you aren't just a daughter anymore, Camellia. You're his pulse. Taking you doesn't just hurt his pride, it stops his heart. And once he's distracted looking for his precious warm skin, I'll bury him in his own cold blood." The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't an escape. It was a kidnapping disguised as a rescue. She was being used as bait once again, just as Ricardo's father had used him decades ago. Ivanov didn't want to save her. He wanted to use her to sharpen the blade that would finish Ricardo. "He was right about the wolves," Camellia whispered, backing away. "He was," Ivanov agreed, the pretense of gallantry vanishing as his men moved to surround her. "But you're the one who walked into the den." As a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder, a gesture devoid of Ricardo's possessive heat, Camellia felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. She wasn't the victim they thought she was. She reached for the diamond choker at her neck, her fingers finding the small concealed transmitter Ricardo had hidden in the clasp the night of the gala. She pressed it hard, her eyes locking onto Ivanov's with a newfound ferocity. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice dropping into a lethal register. "I'm just waiting for the king to arrive." The extraction from the North Pier had been a whirlwind of silent, surgical violence. Ricardo had arrived not as a negotiator, but as a storm, his fury so absolute that Ivanov's men had scattered like ash. Now, back within the reinforced walls of the estate, the adrenaline had curdled into something far more volatile. The air in Ricardo's private quarters was thick, charged with the scent of rain and the heavy, thrumming silence of 2 people who had nearly lost everything. Ricardo stood by the window, his back to her. His knuckles were bruised, and a fresh cut bled sluggishly near the edge of his jaw. He looked like a god of war returning to a hollow temple. "You went to him," he said, his voice a jagged rasp that cut through the quiet. "You chose the wolf over the cage." "I went to see if freedom still had a face," Camellia replied, stepping closer until she was just inches from his shadow. "But all I found was another man who wanted to use me as a weapon. At least you have the decency to call me a trophy." Ricardo spun around, his eyes burning with a light that wasn't cold. It was a scorching, desperate fire. He grabbed her arms, his fingers biting into her skin with a possessive force that made her gasp. "I am not decent, Camellia.
I am a monster who has spent every night since you arrived trying to convince myself I don't need the heat you bring into this house. I told myself you were a debt, a transaction. But tonight, when I thought you were gone, his voice broke, the Ice King fracturing completely. He pulled her against him, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He breathed her in as if she were the only oxygen left in a burning room. Camelia felt the shuddering vibration of his chest against hers, the cold blood of the city's most feared man boiling over into a raw human need. She didn't pull away. She reached up, her fingers tracing the jagged line of the scar on his cheek before cupping the back of her head. "Then stop fighting it," she whispered. The kiss was a collision. It wasn't the tentative touch of a victim and a captor. It was the desperate union of two souls who had been forged in the same fire. Ricardo's lips were hungry, claiming her with a ferocity that spoke of years of isolation. His hands, usually so steady when holding a weapon, trembled as they slid down her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left for secrets. In the heat of the night, the golden cage dissolved. There was no dawn, no debt, and no trophy. Only the warm skin of a woman who had finally found the man behind the monster, and the cold blood of a man who realized that the only thing worth owning was the love he was terrified to ask for. As they sank into the velvet shadows, the lines in the sand were washed away, leaving only the truth of their shared, dangerous heartbeat.
The peace they had found in the shadows of the previous night was shattered not by an outside force, but by the rot within. Morning brought a sky the color of bruised lead, and with it, a silence in the estate that felt wrong, too hollow, too heavy. Camelia was in the conservatory, the scent of damp earth and greenery a brief respite from the tension, when the sound of a single, muffled gunshot echoed through the marble halls. She ran toward Ricardo's study, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She burst through the doors to find a scene that looked like a jagged tear in reality. Ricardo was slumped over his mahogany desk, his white shirt blossoming with a sudden violent crimson. Standing over him was Jin, his most trusted lieutenant, a man who had been the Ice King's shadow for a decade. Jin wasn't holding a weapon of war. He was holding a small silver vial and a silenced pistol, his expression as cold as the man he had just betrayed. "He was becoming soft, Camelia," Jin said, his voice devoid of remorse. "A Don who lets a trophy rule his pulse is a Don who invites his own execution. The city needs a leader with blood like winter, not someone distracted by the heat of a woman." "What did you do to him?" Camelia hissed, rushing to Ricardo's side. She ignored the barrel of the gun Jin leveled at her. Ricardo was conscious, but his eyes were glazed, his pupils blown wide. He tried to speak, but only a choked, wet sound escaped his lips. The vial on the desk was a neurotoxin, a specialized paralyzing agent that left the mind sharp while the body failed. "I've spent years watching him build this empire," Jin continued, stepping back as the heavy footsteps of loyalists turned traitors thudded in the hallway. "I won't watch him dismantle it for a debt collector's daughter. He'll be dead by sunset, and you'll be the one they blame. The warm skin that poisoned the king." Ricardo's hand twitched, his fingers feebly trying to find Camelia's. He was incapacitated, his lethal elegance stripped away by a coward's poison, but his gaze remained fixed on her, a desperate, silent command to survive. As Jin moved to strike her with the butt of his gun, Camelia felt a transformation take hold. The fear that had defined her since the night she was sold evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury she had inherited from the man now dying at her feet. She ducked the blow. Her hand darted to the hidden drawer in Ricardo's desk, the one he had shown her only hours before. Her fingers closed around the cold steel of his backup piece. She didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, grazing Jin's shoulder and forcing him back. "He's not dead yet," Camelia whispered, her voice sounding hauntingly like Ricardo's. "And I am not just his trophy. I am the only thing standing between you and the throne." The estate was no longer a home, it was a tomb in the making. As Jin's men converged on the study, the air grew thick with the metallic tang of blood and the scent of ozone. Ricardo lay motionless, his breathing a shallow rattle, his eyes locked on Camelia with a haunting mixture of agony and awe. He was the Ice King, frozen by a traitor's hand. But as Camelia stood over him, She realized the warm skin he had claimed was now a cloak of fire. "You think you can lead them?" Jin sneered, clutching his bleeding shoulder as he signaled his guards to rush the room. "You're a ghost in a silk dress." "I am the only one who knows where the bodies are buried, Jin," Camellia countered, her voice ringing with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. She didn't just hold the gun. She held the secret codes to the Alfonso offshore ledgers, information Ricardo had whispered to her in the heat of the previous night as a final safeguard. "Kill me, and the Empire's wealth vanishes into the ether. Ricardo didn't just make me a trophy, he made me his vault." The guards hesitated, their greed warring with their loyalty to a dying man. In that moment of doubt, Camellia saw her opening. She reached for the intercom on the desk, her voice broadcasting throughout the entire estate. "To those still loyal to the Alfonso name, Jin has poisoned your dawn. He seeks to burn your pensions and your families to fuel his own ego. Secure the perimeter, bring the doctor, and I will personally see your loyalty rewarded tenfold." The shift was instantaneous. The sound of shouting and gunfire erupted in the hallways as the loyalist faction turned on the traitors. Within minutes, the room was swarmed by men who had once looked at Camellia with pity, but who now looked at her with a burgeoning, fearful respect. As the estate doctor rushed to Ricardo's side to administer the antidote, Camellia didn't step away. She sat on the edge of the desk, the gun resting across her lap, watching as Jin was dragged out in chains. Her radiant skin was smudged with soot and blood, her dark curls wild, but her gaze was as sharp as a diamond. Hours later, the neurotoxin faded. Ricardo sat up, his face pale but his eyes burning with a new, singular devotion. He reached out, taking Camelia's hand and pressing it to his heart, the heart she had kept beating. "They used to call me the king," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And now?" she asked, leaning down until their foreheads touched, recreating the line in the sand they had drawn together. Ricardo looked toward the door, where his captain stood waiting for orders. Orders they now waited for her to confirm. "Now," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his scarred lips, "they know that the Ice King is nothing without his queen." Camellia looked at the city lights through the window. The golden cage was gone. In its place was a throne, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the prize being fought over. She was the power that held the city together. The coronation was silent, bloodstained, and absolute.